So to start off with 6.2, we need to go back and review what we talk about when we're talking about our equilibrium, and specifically what this looks like across the course of the long run. So first, let's talk about one of these scenarios. We have three different ones we had looked at. Let's talk about the scenario where we see that we're operating below our potential. That just means that our short run intersection, where we're operating right now, is to the left of our long run aggregate supply. Because if our long run aggregate supply represents us being fully efficient, being at a point to the left means we're not being fully efficient. We see our resources are not being used to the best of our ability. One of the best examples of this would be our labor. We see that if we're not using our labor efficiently, that means we have labor available, we're just not utilizing it. And so we would say, therefore, that unemployment is above the natural rate. That cyclical unemployment exists in this scenario. We also see that our output, our real GDP, is below its potential. If we were using all of our resources efficiently, we would be at a point like YP, our potential, that green line. However, we're not there. And so we're further to the left along that real GDP x-axis there. So this means that we're experiencing a recessionary gap. The point where we are at right now is below our potential, below where we could be. And therefore, we're experiencing a recession. Now, what about the other side of things? Maybe we're at a point where our short run intersection is to the right of our long run aggregate supply. Well, what we would see is that means we're operating above our potential. What we would say about prices is that prices are actually higher than normal, and we would say that we're experiencing inflationary pressure. Now, we said some inflation is completely normal, right? Because we said in a growing economy, GDP moves in the same direction as inflation. But we see that if our GDP, like in this case, is going a little bit too far, same thing's going to be true for our inflation. We're actually going to see, too, that our unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment, and our output is above its potential. It's beyond where we could be. And so that's an expansionary gap. And if you remember, we had talked about that this is possible for the short run. It's just not sustainable in the long run. We use the example of running a marathon. The green line represents you running at a pace that you could sustain for that whole marathon. However, yeah, you could walk up to the start line and take off sprinting, and that's that point to the right, but you can't stay there. You start sprinting for a little while, and after a while you get tired, you have to stop. And that's kind of what we're saying is that we can't stay there. We need to be at a point where it's sustainable. And finally, we see that we might have a situation where we're operating at our potential. And we said that this is the maximum sustainable output in the long run. All of our resources are being used efficiently. We see that our unemployment is at its natural rate, which means we don't have any of that cyclical unemployment. And we say that our economy is producing at a GDP equal to its potential. And this is our goal. This is where we want to be. We want to be at that long run equilibrium wherever our aggregate demand curve intersects with our short run aggregate supply curve at the same point that we intersect with our long run aggregate supply curve. So let's take a look at an example from the United States. We're actually going to pull the numbers specifically from the US at the end of quarter 3. And so this is numbers that were pulled from the end of October 2020. Sorry, my bad. The end of September 2020. So we have our aggregate demand curve, we have our short run aggregate supply curve, and that's our short run equilibrium. And we see that our CPI at this point was 258.73. And this was occurring at a real output of $18.584 trillion. So what that means is that our actual real GDP at the end of quarter 3 was $18.584 trillion, right? That's our output. But one thing that we'll see is that the Federal Reserve and the BEA, they actually track what our potential could be. So this is where we are actually operating. But we have a potential. We're like, okay, well, what if we were using all of our resources to the best of our ability? Where might we be at? And you might be able to guess where we should be at. If you think about this short run intersection, do you think that we're operating below or above our potential? Well, our potential for quarter 3 was actually $19.33 trillion, which would put our green line, that long run aggregate supply, somewhere over here. So if you notice, our short run intersection is to the left of our potential. It's to the left of where we could be. And so what do we call this? Well, we call this a recessionary gap, where we see that our economy is experiencing a recession. And that's exactly what we saw throughout quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2020.